Okay, welcome again, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second presentation in the series of 3 for the second half of the Energy Policy and Planning course under the e-learning masters in e-learning masters in renewable energy technologies. For this unit, we're going to be looking at policy instruments for renewable energy and energy access. Now, the broad outline of this unit would be, of this presentation, would be really 2 parts. One would be to look at general principles and basic concepts, and under that we would look at energy policy triangles. These are triangles that depict the cardinal issues that are considered usually during energy policy analysis and energy policy development. So we would look at these triangles, and then there's also the energy policy objective. I mean, how these issues are then translated into policy objectives that are then fleshed out using various policy instruments and measures available to the energy policy maker. So the second part of the presentation will then look specifically at these policy instruments and measures. What are they? What kinds of things are done, are used, generally in the renewable energy sector or subsector, but also in terms of increasing access to electricity and increasing access to clean cooking and heating systems in general, fuels, technologies, etc. Now, so if we start off with the general principles, as I said, what is often referred to as the energy policy triangle is a triangle that has 3 key, let's call them issues for consideration. I mean, number 1 is economics and growth, and what this really means is that, I mean, the whole point of energy and energy policy is to make energy available for economic activity, for economic growth, and generally for development in a given country, in a given region, in a given jurisdiction. Okay, so that's usually number 1. Now, number 2, depending on how you go, whether you go clockwise or counterclockwise, is energy security. Now, very often countries or regions or states do not want to, because energy is so critical for economic development and for well-being, you don't want to leave yourself in a situation where you are not sure that you will have your energy supply, and therefore your economic life will not be disrupted, abruptly. So energy security is another issue that is of great concern in energy policy analysis. And then the environment, particularly over the last couple of decades, the care for the environment, sensitivity to environmental degradation, and more broadly climate change and mitigating, abating climate change, those have become very important issues also to consider in developing energy policy. So these 3 issues, come together in the form shown and are usually referred to as the energy policy triangle. But then there are variants of these issues that become more important, especially when you're dealing in developing countries. Now, whereas, as I said earlier, economic growth, economic well-being is usually the number 1 objective, you'd realize that in many developing countries there are large numbers of poor people. I mean, some countries have 60-70% people living below the poverty line. So yes, economic development is the overall objective, but within that you want to see reduced poverty, and therefore you want programs that are deliberately targeted at poverty reduction. So even though we talk about about economic development and economic growth generally, when it comes to developing countries, at least over the last, I would say again, decade or so, the poverty reduction has become on its own a prime concern. Then there's also gender considerations. I mean, again, especially in developing countries where energy use has a strong gender component. I mean, firewood is generally collected by women and children, and even with children, it's usually the girl children who go and collect firewood. The boys are doing something else, playing football or doing something else, with their dads and with their fathers and things like that. So energy generally has a strong gender dimension. Many women have to spend a lot of time either collecting firewood or pounding, things that could be done if energy services were available for grinding and activities like that. So one cannot ignore gender when one deals with energy policy and energy sector development in developing countries. And then a third issue is technology. I mean, many countries are wary of the fact that they are dependent on the industrialized world for energy technologies. They are importing practically everything that goes into their energy system, all the way from the power plants to the wires that carry the electricity into homes, and in the regulatory devices and things like that. So this concern, it exists also in the industrialized world, but it is a lot more embedded in various systems that are in place in the industrialized world, whereas in the developing countries, quite often there's nobody taking care of that, and the dependence is also a lot more glaring. So these three issues become very important in the developing country context, and therefore it has led people, well, like myself, to put forward the concept of energy policy triangles, building on this Star of David-like configuration of the triangles, where at the core of it is the economic stroke growth, security and environment, but superimposed on that is the gender, poverty reduction and technological development or technological capacity building, which becomes extremely important, especially in developing countries. And the idea here is that for developing country energy policy practitioners, it's important to look more broadly than just the conventional economic, security and environmental considerations that you will see in a lot of the energy policy literature. Now, what I show here is an example of how these triangles have been used in a very recent global activity, which is in the production of the global energy assessment. I mean, some 300 academics and leading policy experts from around the world, from industrialized developing countries, from east, from west, came together to develop the global energy assessment. We were led by Professor Thomas Johansson, who is very well known, based in Sweden, and he was co-chair of the executive committee. But the other co-chair was Professor Anand Patwardhan from India, and the work was supported by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis based in Luxembourg in Austria, and we had Professor Nakicenovic Nebosia, as well as Luis Gomez Echeverri, leading the secretariat that underpinned this assessment. And there you can see that the three key drivers that were used here were energy access, because we wanted to see the fact that many countries now don't have access to electricity, don't have access to clean cooking fuels and technologies. So that became an overriding concern within the global energy assessment. And then there was the classical issue of energy security and also the environment. But superimposed on these were the technology drivers. I mean, the extent to which new technologies are being developed, the regional diversity, driver, as you say, the diversity in supply sources, diversity in usage patterns. And then the third was the environmental and the social awareness. As you know, there are people who are prepared to pay carbon tax because they put a high premium on climate change, global warming. There are others who think it's not that critical for their well-beings, and would therefore not be willing to spend that much on it. So these were additional drivers that were imposed on the energy triangle for the global energy assessment, and the core objective there was to promote sustainable development around the world. So one can vary these triangles depending on where one wants to put the emphasis, or one can use, if you like, the more elaborate Star of David type of configuration, where one is looking at a lot more factors at play. Now, if we bring this now into context as far as the economic growth, development, poverty reduction is concerned, I mean, various studies now over the last, let's say, decade have shown clearly that there's a direct link between energy and development. And the graph you see here is the Human Development Index versus the commercial energy consumption per capita. And as you can see, there's a correlation. There's a correlation, and you can see that we find countries like my own Ghana, Senegal, Nepal, Morocco tend to be in the lower energy consuming end, and our human development indices are also generally quite low, below about 0.55 HDI. And then you have those countries that have a lot more energy supply, commercial energy supply, and also have higher HDI. Countries, even developing countries like Chile and Malaysia. Once you add the Japans and the USAs, you go even further into the commercial energy consumption part of the curve, and significantly higher also HDI. Now, what these graphs tell us is that in the lower range, a small amount of commercial energy can, this is where the elasticity is coming again. You're talking a small amount of commercial energy leads to a high increase or is related to a high increase in human development index, whereas you have a more elastic part of the curve in the higher end, where you need large amounts of capital commercial energy to correlate with relatively small increases in HDI, but the HDIs are high anyway, so it's really not an issue there. But for the low end, where HDIs are low, commercial energy seems to make a big difference one way or the other. So this is translated into a stylized curve that was developed by Amulia Reddy and picked up by Vijay Modi and co. in Columbia University. Now you can see the elastic region of the curve, where the change in the HDI versus the change in energy is very high, because small amounts of energy, commercial energy change, give rise to relatively high amounts of HDI increases. And then you have the inelastic region, where large increases of energy consumption are correlated with really marginal improvements in HDI. The energy doesn't seem to be the key factor. Other things become more important. And of course, there's a transition zone where it's sort of in between. Now, if you then look now at the global final energy consumption, now here we are using data for 2009 coming from REN 21. This is the Renewable Energy Network for the 21st century. Now you would see that renewables account for about 16% of the global final energy consumption. Fossil fuels account for a whopping 81%, and you have nuclear accounting for 2.8%. Now of the renewables, you would see that traditional biomass has a major contribution, and then you've got that's already about 10%. Then you've got hydropower that constitutes about 3.4% of the 16, and then you have biomass, solar, geothermal, for heating, and of course wind, solar, biomass, geothermal for power generation, and then you also have some biofuel. So you would see that as things stand now, renewables, including hydropower, play a relatively small role compared to fossil fuels that really are playing the dominant role. And this is important also, because as the environmental concerns increase and as climate awareness increases, there's a bigger drive now to increase clean energy sources, particularly renewable energy. There are many who argue that nuclear is also clean. There are many who insist indeed that nuclear is also clean, but then of course there's the counter arguments of safety, and the recent happenings in Japan, the Fukushima reactor, really haven't helped at all the nuclear cause. So there's a much stronger and growing demand and drive to increase the amount of renewables, largely to respond to the environmental issue, the environmental concern, but also because renewables are seen as providing greater opportunities for income generation, for employment, for local resource utilization. Because you're talking solar and wind, which, solar particularly, and biomass, which are available, practically in most parts of the world. So opportunities for employment generation, local income, generation become considerably higher. Now, so still, with regard to environmental concerns, I mean, the evidence is there, and the Stern review that was done in 2007 showed quite clearly that energy accounted for the largest segment of global warming, and hence of climate change. You have You have power contributing 24%, industry 14%, other energy related emissions constituting 5%, of course transport and buildings, so that's a huge chunk there. And then the non-energy emissions, basically land use changes, agriculture, waste, they account for some 35% or so. So something like 65% is really coming from energy related emissions, and that's really a source of concern, and that's why the environmental driver is becoming stronger and stronger over time. And if you couple that with the employment and also with energy security considerations, then you see why renewable energy is becoming a hot issue as time goes on. Now, the Stern review went into greater extent to look at the climate change and the various impacts of climate change linked to global temperature rise. So it shows what would happen to food, water, ecosystems for various levels of temperature rise: 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3, 4, and 5 degrees. A lot of international initiatives now are targeting 2 degrees temperature rise, because really beyond that you get very severe impacts. In the case of food, you're talking about failing crop yields in many areas. You're talking about falling yields in many developed regions of the world because of the temperature changes, large temperature changes. Then of course sea level rise threatens major cities, small island states. Significant decreases in water availability in many areas, including the Mediterranean and Southern Africa, as global temperatures increase beyond 2 degrees. There's also a rising number of species that will face extinction, increasing risk of dangerous feedbacks and abrupt large-scale shifts in the climate change. You're getting deserts that are increasing in size, irreversible processes. And therefore, beyond 2 degrees centigrade, there's grave concern that we could cause irreparable damage to the globe. And therefore, that's also further underpinning the drive for renewable energy forms that do not emit significant greenhouse gases, and therefore have a benign effect on the global climate. So that takes us to the issue of energy security, and I say there's been several definitions again for energy security, but one is by Khatib in 2000, is the continuous availability of energy in varied forms, in sufficient quantities and at reasonable prices. Now, all these components are important, the different forms, the sufficient quantities, and the reasonable prices. Because if energy is available and people can't buy it, then it's really effectively not available or not accessible. And if you don't have different forms, then once you have one compromised, either by war in an oil-producing region, major oil-producing region, or by a drought in a major hydro-producing part of the region, then you're going to have problems. So you want it in varied forms, and you also want it in sufficient quantities. Now, this way, then you have limited vulnerability to transient or longer disruptions of imported supplies, and you're also talking about availability of local and imported resources to meet growing demand over time and at reasonable prices. Now, the converse, or if you like, the contrary, is to look at energy insecurity and shortages, and there you have very negative impacts, handicap on productive activities. They also undermine consumer welfare, and they discourage investors from by threatening production and increasing cost, and therefore investors don't want to come and invest in your country. So this becomes a source of concern. Now, there are various energy security options. One is local adequacy, where you're looking at abundant and varied forms of indigenous energy resources, and also adequate strategic national reserves. What you don't have, you import and you store to make sure that it's available when needed. So local adequacy is one major option. Foreign imports then is the next option. So energy resources and products freely imported, you want to relax your border controls and things like that to allow imports to come in freely through ports and other transport channels, and through cross-border energy grids. Regional electricity grids become important for foreign imports. And then diversification of import sources and types of fuel. You don't want to be locked into just hydro. You want a little bit of, of oil, a little bit of natural gas, and of course a little bit of renewables to ensure that you have some balance in case of any problems in any one type of energy. And then of course adequate financial resources. That means you must make sure your economy is growing and you're generating the revenues to be able to import fuel, as needed. Third option is technological and managerial know-how. If you build your technological know-how, then you can develop your indigenous renewable energy sources, for use, or you can manage the extraction and the exploitation of your indigenous renewable energy sources, and also the development of domestic power generating refining facilities to meet part of the local energy consumption requirements. If your refineries are working well, unlike some countries that we know where the refineries have been built but very poor operating and maintenance records, then really it's of no use. So you want to build your technological and your managerial know-how to be able to manage the facilities that are in your country to ensure that energy is supplied continuously in different varied forms and also at affordable levels. Now, if we look at what policy instruments and measures are available for promoting these objectives that I've just spoken about, and if we look at the three areas, well, first we would take a look at some general instruments and measures. I mean, instruments and measures really are ways and means by which policy objectives are achieved. Okay, so you have objectives. You want to increase national energy security, you want to increase national technological know-how in, say, hydropower technology, or you want to supply enough energy to ensure that your economy grows by 5% per annum or 10% per annum, or that you are able to reduce poverty by 10% per annum, so that within a 6-7 year period you can, in principle, eliminate poverty in your economy. So those kinds of objectives, what are the instruments by which you can achieve them? So energy policy instruments generally refer to the ways and means by which you can achieve energy policy objectives. Now, people tend to distinguish between the two terms, policy instruments and policy measures. Policy instruments generally tend to refer to market-based or economic mechanisms, tariffs, taxes, levies, things like that. Whereas policy measures tend to relate to all other mechanisms or approaches, like setting up new institutions, like doing more awareness raising. For instance, LPG. Many people are afraid to use LPG. They are scared that it is dangerous, it might blow up and so on. And therefore the government or an agency might decide to spend money educating people on the safety aspects of LPG and what it can do or what it cannot do. So those are all things that people tend to refer collectively to as policy measures, as opposed to instruments that are more economic based, more market based type mechanisms. Now, there are various types of energy policy instruments that are used: taxes, subsidies, tariffs, financing schemes, capital buy downs, low interest funds that are available to energy sector or subsector developers. And energy policy measures generally refer to information and education, normative command and control measures. As for instance, you cannot export LPG because it's locally produced, or you cannot transport petrol across your borders, and things like that. Real command and control type measures. And then of course research and development. If a government or company put a lot of funding into research and development, so new technologies, new types of utilization can be developed, and that's another way of promoting the achievement of energy policy objectives. And then you've got the institutions and sectoral reform, where you are either setting up new institutions, you are changing the laws so that different types of institutions can enter into the market or into the sector. There's a whole lot of things that one can do at the institutional level, and that's also regarded as a set of energy policy measures. Now, there are other tools that are coming up over time. I mean, it's a living world we live in, and therefore targets, for instance, have become very important, especially when it comes to renewable energy. Many countries that are setting targets, 20% renewable energy by 2020, I think is what the European Union has set for itself. and different targets. There's also caps, caps on emissions, caps on levels of utilization of particular forms of fuel that one can set. And then there are sunsets, sunset clauses. I mean, very often, I know in our part of the world, when we introduce, let's say, a lifeline tariff, we introduce it, we don't put any sunset clause on it. No, it's a sunset clause. It's a kind of a measure that forces a policy instrument, to wean itself out. So, for instance, if you introduce a subsidy of say 10%, you can introduce an additional sunset clause so that over the first 5 years it is constant, and then the remaining 5 years, it reduces by say 2% every year until the subsidy is completely withdrawn. And it's good to do this upfront so that investors, project developers can plan with this and know that for the first 5 years they can enjoy the subsidy and come into the market. But over time they will have to get more efficient because that subsidy will be withdrawn. And sunsets are the approach to ensuring that these signals are sent, to the players in the energy sector or in the energy market. Now, when it comes to specific case of renewable energy, I mean, then there are a number of things that have come up. I mean, number one is the set of regulatory policies where you're talking like feed-in tariffs, where special tariffs are set for renewable energy, and different renewable energies will have different feed-in tariffs. Solar will have it, wind will have it, biogas and others. Small hydro would have their own tariffs based on the costs of those tariffs and based on the premium that a given society or region places on clean energy, and as I said, on the environmental policy driver. And then there are other tools, other instruments in that pack. There's renewable portfolio standards and quotas, where you set a certain limit for, say, the utilities to purchase some of their energy from renewables, or blending mandates, where the energy companies, the oil companies, have to blend a certain amount of maybe biofuels into their petroleum products for sale, to the public. There's net metering. Net metering is where you have a meter, an electric meter, that reads one way when you are taking electricity from the grid. But if you have a renewable system, for instance, in your home, on the top of your roof, and at night you're not consuming much energy, or better still, midday you've gone to work, there's no energy being consumed, but the solar system is producing energy, you can sell some back into the grid. So then the meter reads the other way. So at the end of the month, the net is what you pay. If you owe the grid or the utility, you pay the utility. If the utility owes you, then it pays you some tariff, and that depends again on government policy. The green certificates, which can be traded, if you produce a certain amount of renewable energy, you get a certificate for it, and you can trade this because somebody wants that, but doesn't quite have as much sun or as much space on their roof or something else to do. Then there are fiscal incentives, like capital subsidies, grants and rebates, investment and production tax credits, sales tax exemptions, energy production payments. Depending on how much you pay, you get paid for it. And then of course there's public financing, public direct investment, public competitive bidding. Competitive bidding is used a lot in a number of countries. I mean, in China and several other countries, where on an annual or certain periodic basis, the public is allowed to bid for tranches of, say, wind power plants or solar PV grid connected power plants, and that helps to drive the cost down, through the competitive bidding mechanism. Then if we move on to access to electricity, and then subsequently we'll look at access to other fuels, it's important to start off by recognizing that a number of countries have cracked the access problem. And if you look on this chart, you see the UK and the USA, were the first to do so. By about 1950, 1960, the two countries had practically 100% of their population having electricity in their homes. There's another wave of countries for which we have data here. This is countries like Mexico, Mauritius, Brazil, who have come in later, in the late 90s, and really by 2010 either at 100% or close to 100%. And then of course you have the latter set of countries. You've got South Africa, you've got India, that are now in the neighborhood of mid 70s to 80% access to electricity and increasing. And then, of course, there are many more countries, which I'll show in a minute. But the point here is that a good number of countries have shown the way that it can be done. This graph here shows Ghana and what our prognosis is for the future. I mean, Ghana has come from 1990, from about 25, a little 26, 27% in 1990 to a little over 50%, in 2006. Right now, Ghana states its access rate at close to 70%. Now, when this chart was done, the idea was to see what Ghana needs to do to achieve its target of universal access to electricity by 2020. And this graph suggested that there was a need to change the business model, so that Ghana would achieve it. Otherwise, then we would go beyond 2030 and still not achieve the universal access target that was set by government in 1989. Now, if you compare with South Africa, at the time this was done, South Africa was ahead. South Africa still is ahead, as you saw in the previous graph. And there's Mauritius that is already, at 100%. The average for Africa in 2005 was around to a little over 20%, 24, 25%. And you have countries like the Gambia, Uganda, and so on that have 10% or less access to electricity. Now, this chart shows again some more African countries' data for 2010. Mauritius is practically 100%. But then on the other hand, as I say, you can see Uganda and Malawi, which are below 10%. Now, if we put this then in a global framework, I mean, one can see various trends that were plotted by Vijay Modi in 2005, showing how various regions of the world have seen their access to electricity change over time. And the spectacular one is the case of East Asia, China, which had the highest rates of lack of access to electricity up till about 1980 and not long after that. And then they had a big dip, consistently over time, bringing their access rates currently to less than 100 million people, 100 out of, so less than 10%, 100 out of 1.4 billion or so. You're talking less than 10% of the people don't have access to electricity, as we speak. But the other regions, I mean, including our own Africa, were set to increase beyond 2010. The South Asia was expected to start going down a bit, and more recent data will confirm this. But Africa was the troublesome part, where you could see that our rates were still set to go up. So, question then is, what is feasible now? Currently the UN Secretary General is launching a new initiative on sustainable energy for all by 2030, and the question is, what can be done in the case of Africa, South Asia, and those other countries that don't have sustainable energy for their peoples. Now, the argument in this graph and with the colored curves is that the experience of China could possibly be replicated in Africa and South Asia. The question is, how can this be done? And therefore, the argument here is that one would need a multi-track and very innovative approach, which would have to include grid extension, microgrid electrification, and also distributed systems. One would have to all hands on deck, all technologies on board, and with some innovative tools, innovative policy interventions, one should be able to achieve universal access to electricity by 2030. Now, if we move on to cooking fuels, I mean, the case here is for LPG, where one can see, countries like Benin, Burkina Faso having less than 10% access to LPG, and all the way up to Mauritius that has about 96% access to LPG. Now, again, what can be done in this case to increase access to modern cooking and heating fuels? Again, another chart shows that it's a bit more serious in some countries, Liberia, Mali, Central Africa, Guinea, and so on. You're talking 1%, less than 1%, 2% and things like that. So the scale of the challenge is very high when it comes to modern fuels. This chart shows the majority of people in India, sub-Saharan Africa. You're talking, several hundred million people. In Africa, it's close to 600 million people. In India, you're talking more than 700 million people that are relying on traditional biomass. China is also high, but as you can see, China is going down gradually over time. It's not quite as spectacular as what China did with electricity, but the numbers are going down nonetheless. And again, a similar question will be posed: are deep cuts possible? Is it possible to reverse these trends considerably and do what even China has not been able to do to date, and bring down the numbers of people that are relying on traditional biomass and increase the levels of clean energy, modern fuels being used? Again, what policy instruments can be used? And the argument here is that a multi-pronged approach would be required, across board. Extensive scaling up action by national governments, integrated pro-poor, gender sensitive. You remember the energy policy triangles in the beginning, especially when it comes to energy for cooking and heating. The gender becomes critical because of the role women and girl children play in this area, but also because of the impact that poor, dirty cooking fuels have on women and children. It's important that gender be factored into the policy. So policies that integrate energy access programs into overall infrastructure development schemes are going to be important, because unlike electricity, one cannot treat energy for cooking just as an extension of wires or an installation of solar panels on people's homes. There, it's going to be more embedded in the social, cultural, and economic systems, and one needs to think through this quite carefully. Now, innovative financing models are going to be required, because you have lots of poor people who are picking up, firewood from the bush, not paying anything for it, and therefore, if you're going to move them into modern fuels for which they have to pay some price, then you're going to need some really innovative financing models that respond to their circumstances. And then, of course, there's going to have to be a multi-actor national institutional capacity to deliver energy services for the poor. You're going to need all hands on deck here, because, as I said earlier on, even China has not been able to introduce the massive cuts in people without access to modern cooking fuels. So if the rest of us are going to do it together with China, we're going to really have to bring all actors on board, and we're going to have to be as innovative as we can. Again, for this unit, I propose 2 exercises. First one is to continue with the exercise we did in Unit 5, looking at the 4 kilowatt grid connected solar PV system, and basically to still continue using the red screen to look at a range of feed-in tariffs. As I said in this lecture, feed-in tariffs is probably the most popular energy policy instrument that has been used to promote renewable energy across the world. And this exercise requires that we look at a range of feed-in tariffs. I mean, if the current end user tariff in your country is 10 cents per kilowatt hour, then look at a range of feed-in tariffs, say from 10 all the way up to say 30. You saw that in one of the slides that solar, the cost of solar was set at 30. So one should look at a range of feed-in tariffs from about 10 to 40 or 50 and see how that impacts on payback period, on internal rate of return, and also on net present value. And in one of our classes, to come, one of our sessions, live sessions to come, we will have presentations, we'll have a discussion on the results that have been obtained. Exercise 6B is to choose any sub-Saharan African country other than your own country, and to study the energy policy, to identify the policy instruments and measures that are being used to achieve universal access to electricity and clean cooking. Now, each group should be, again, as I say, 4 to 5 students, and they will make a 5-minute PowerPoint presentation at a date and time to be provided by the instructor. I mean, I will provide a date, fairly soon, for us to have a session where each group will make its presentation. Well,